Sì, prova. Sì, prova, sì.
Buongiorno e benvenuti al terzo giorno della conferenza internazionale sui disastri ed eventi naturali fra ipotesi e realtà in Ostia e in Porto. Iniziamo oggi la giornata con l'intervento di dottor Paolo Tomassini che con piacere ora vi introdurrò la sua carriera accademica. Paolo Tomassini is currently a scientific member of the French School in Rome after being a doctoral then postdoctoral fellow at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. Archaeologists specialize in the study of Roman wall painting and building archaeology. His research is based essentially in central Italy and especially in Ostia Antica. Perhaps we can close the window. I can close. Oh, you, Paolo, sorry. Few minutes is necessary. Yeah, thank you. He is part of the project Ostian's Transformations, investigating an urban model, along with Marco Cavalieri, Martina Marano, and Julian Richard, with whom this presentation is signed. This project, led by the two Belgian universities of Louvain and Namur, with the collaboration of the Parco Archeologico di Ostia Antica, intends to study the resilience strategies of Roman Ostia in order to find ideas for the transformation of our modern cities. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Laura. So as planned, I will talk in English. First of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting us. We're very happy to be here. And as you said, I'm here in representation of a group of Marco Cavalieri, Martina Marano, who's here in the room, and Julian Richard. We are part of this project, as you mentioned, so I will talk for the group. So the intent of this talk is to share with you some thoughts on the possibility to identify, through the archaeological analysis of the walls, traces of external events of natural origin. Some of the results were recently published by who's speaking to you in the Mélange of a French school in Rome, but we thought this was the perfect occasion to share these and other observations with you in order to discuss in the broader interdisciplinary chronological and geographical perspective given by this very interesting conference. When we look at any archaeological structure, we are inevitably confronted with more or less important transformations or modifications, repairs, reinforcements, closures, obliterations, destructions, reconstructions, enlargements, redecorations, and this is particularly true in Ostia, where most of the buildings we see, built during the economic boom of the early 2nd century, have been used for several decades, if not centuries, and were therefore adapted and transformed, sometimes with very different functions, by the people who lived therein. The walls of Ostia, therefore, constitute a fundamental basis for reading and analyzing the micro-transformations undergone by the buildings. Most of the traces of these transformations are due to change of function, changes of owners, sometimes changes of taste or any other reason that led people to transform the space they lived or worked in. Sometimes, however, the traces of transformation are not linked to functional or aesthetic reasons, but are the result of structural interventions, namely repair works whose objective is to reinforce, reconstruct, and limit structural damage. The question of this contribution is how to interpret these traces. Are they planned interventions to reinforce the walls or rapid answers to external events? And if so, what kind of event? What factors can contribute to the transformation of a building? Building archaeology will be of great help, of course, since it's only through a careful reading of the vertical stratigraphy, the construction techniques, and all the types of materials used that it will be possible to provide concrete data, when extended to several architectural contexts. And so this will allow us to move from the micro to the macro level. As the other contributions in this conference have very well demonstrated, the geomorphological, social and political context of Ostia have had a strong impact on its buildings. During its long history, Ostia had to adapt itself to a series of challenges, whether positive, economic boom, demographic increase, social mixing, public and private investments, or negative, flooding, silting, fires and other natural events, invasions, social segregation, progressive abandonment. In every situation, the city and its population have shown adaptability and resilience, but also a capacity to keep its original layout over the centuries by reusing, recycling and requalifying spaces, buildings and even building materials. In recent times, scholars revealed the connection between environment and the capacity of urban resilience, as climate change and natural disasters are serious threats to cities' resilience. Moreover, the environment influences human activity and vice versa in a complex dynamic. And this is particularly true for Ostia. As we saw yesterday, the great instability of the Tiber Delta determined important changes in the landscape of Ostia and in the city itself. First, the Tiber overflowed many times over the centuries, changing its course and causing frequent floods. Secondly, due to the geological nature of Ostia's subsoil, the region is frequently subject to rising groundwater, so we all already talked about it in the other days, but just a reminder. And the geomorphological situation of Ostia is one of the keys to understand its urban development and the need to progressively rise the level of buildings and streets. And moreover, recent research by Laura Pecchioli and her colleagues have demonstrated the Tiber Delta is subject to seismic movements, even if it was discussed. But then we have traces and evidence. In some cases, these seismic events can cause considerable damage, even with low magnitude seismic waves. Human and social factors also had an impact on the stability of Ostian buildings, and particularly the 2nd century multi-story buildings. In fact, most of these buildings are built by entrepreneurs driven by a desire for speculation and trying to make the most of a surface area by building a lot in a short time, using every type of building materials they had at their disposal, even recycled raw materials from the demolition of former buildings. So when we observe structural damage and repair on the walls of our buildings, how do we know which one of these factors have caused it? Sometimes linking a reaction to a specific cause is possible, and some known examples. In order to fight against the rising groundwater, the most important countermeasure, already mentioned in other presentation, was the gradual and repeated rising of the level of the streets and buildings. And the need to use these thick layers to prevent flooding and slow down the rising of water is shown by the massive use of hydrophobic and draining materials in the rising levels, and in particular fragments of painted plasters, which were carefully collected from former buildings and specifically reused for this purpose. Another countermeasure against the structural deficiencies of the buildings was to add new and more solid foundation to the building next to the reused wall crests of previous buildings. And in fact, the new foundations of the Ostian buildings, at least when we can look at them by excavations, and especially so at the beginning of the 2nd century AD, these foundations are particularly massive and in many cases exceed 2 meters in depth. On the slide, I quickly show you an example from the Caseggiato delle Taberne Finestrate in the 4th region of the city. Here in this building, stratigraphic surveys conducted in 1973 provided insight into the foundations of several of the building's internal wall, which rested on a double foundation, a rough opus reticulatum wall, 2 feet wide and 1 meter high, made either against the ground or by hand as a wall, resting on a reinforced sub-foundation, 1.2 meters wide and at least 1 meter deep. Such powerful foundations are explained by the type of buildings they were intended to support. In this case, a 3 or 4 even story architectural complex, built entirely in opus testaccium with 60 centimeters to 2 feet thick walls on the ground floor. Similar and equally imposing buildings were constructed about the same time elsewhere in the city and with very similar technical characteristics. But there are some countermeasures that are difficultly linked to a specific cause, and it is the case of the many pillars, buttresses and partially reconstructed walls that are very frequent in Ostia. Do they share the same cause? It is the question. And is it possible to recognize in different areas of the city the traces of a common event? Only the detailed study of specific case studies based on an archaeological analysis may provide some useful data. And here in this presentation we would like to focus about a very large number of structural transformations that can be seen on various buildings in Ostia between the end of the 2nd century AD and the beginning of the 3rd century AD. In fact, in many cases, the structures building during the boom of the 120s required repair work only a few years after their construction, as early as the Antonine period and especially during the Severan period. And one of the most suggestive and well-known repairs is the well-known Caseggiato dei Molini in the 1st region. Between the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd, the building was subject to particularly extensive repairs. In fact, the building underwent important reorganization works that can really be defined as structural interventions and which are not strictly related to the function of the building. Large brick pillars, arches and buttresses were added to support the weight of the north and south wall of the central room, as you can see here in red, as their purpose was to avoid the whole structure to tilt horizontally. Elsewhere in the building are several elements that show that the structure of the earlier periods were affected by significant damage, which required special interventions. Brick pillars supporting a double arch, associated to cracks in the walls. I was here in this slide, so the two pictures at the center and below. Associated to cracks in the wall of the previous faces, but also partial reconstruction of the walls of the ground floor. And this is room 22, as you can see here in red, the partial reconstruction of the wall, reconstructed in bricks on an earlier opus mixtum wall, so keeping the original wall, but reconstructing on the low part of the wall. In the 4th region of the city, the already mentioned Caseggiato delle Taberne Finestrate presents similar interventions. Some years later to its constructions, in the years 120, the building underwent extensive renovation and repair work that could be dated, thanks to the stratigraphical analysis, between the years 150s and the years 220s AD. In room A and room F, so we are here and here on the map, a series of massive brick pillars were built, completely disrupting the residential function it had acquired only a couple of decades earlier, and you can see the picture over there. In addition, several walls of the ground floor were completely rebuilt in the same manner as we saw before on the ground floor without touching the foundation, and this is important, nor the upper levels. In addition, there is a series of smaller pillars leaning against the wall, acting as buttresses in order to give them additional support and prevent them from tilting horizontally. All these measures seem to belong to a single phase of structural repairs, responding to a common need. That of intervening as strategic and more weak areas of the building. The damage must have been particularly severe to justify such extensive measures, as evidenced by the numerous cracks in the walls of the earlier phases, which are not present in the later walls. These cracks, of a particular shape to which we will return later, are located in the structurally more stressed areas of the building, which are also the most reconstructed parts: the facade, the rear of the building, and the central part here, where are also the most, and the central part where the orientation of the building and of the parcel of land changes to respect the parcel boundaries. Several traces of very similar repairs have been identified in the direct vicinity of this building, as in the Terme delle Sei Colonne and the Caseggiato del Vicolo del Dioniso, but also in the 5th region of the city. In the Caseggiato dei Lottatori, along the Via della Fortuna Nonaria, several traces of partial reconstruction of the ground floor can be seen along the northern facade of the building and in several places of the supporting walls of the building. And on the other side of the street, the block 5-6 with the Caseggiato del Sole, Mitreo dei Serpenti and the building 5-6-2 presents an analogous situation. Quite similar measures, so lots of examples, but it's in order to discuss them later together. Similar measures are also adopted in the well-known examples of the Caseggiato dell'Ercole, where Hannah Stöger had identified several traces of structural repairs that she attributes to the Severan period. Brick pillars added at the corners or at the center of the rooms, partial reconstructions and underpinnings of walls rebuilt on the remains of the partially level structures. Here another example. On the eastern side of the portico on the Cardo Maximus, this area here, a double row of pillars is added to the existing one in order to support the cracked walls, partially reconstructed. And here as well, the cracks are always associated with the repair works, and they are only in the older walls, but not in the Severian nor later walls. It is interesting to note that all these structural interventions highlighted in the examples we showed adopt similar solution. Supporting pillars in the center of the rooms, buttresses next to the walls, buttresses with arches and flying buttresses external to the walls or the buildings, closures and partial reconstructions of walls on the ground floors. Although different, these measures all seem to respond to the same logic, which is to repair a damaged wall, strengthen a weakened structure, and avoid possible future damage. The first thing to note is that all these interventions, apart from sharing a similar modus operandi, take place at the same time, in the same period, between the end of the 2nd century and the first decade of the 3rd. This is what we learn from the relative dating provided by the stratigraphic study of the elevations, but also from the great homogeneity of the construction technique. The choice of bricks is indeed always the same. It is characterized by the use of recycled bricks, or, in the case of new batches used, of besales cut into triangles of 21.5 centimeters in length, average number, and sometimes, even often, with an epigraphic stamp, with a printed disc, as we saw on the slide here. So this example from the Taberne Finestrada, but there are also others in the other buildings. The mortars are characterized including the height of the joints, which is systematically between 2 and 3 centimeters, which make them clearly recognizable in relation to older and more recent construction techniques. So the main question here is, how can these structural works be correctly interpreted? Can we speak of a kind of unprogrammed obsolescence of the buildings of the Medio-Imperial period, which would present the same type of structural weaknesses in different areas of the city at the same time? Could these weaknesses be attributed to the building methods of the period? Builders, in fact, moved quickly, and they repeatedly made saving on materials and on structurally important elements. However, the structural framework of the buildings never seems to be called into question, since the foundations are systematically maintained, at least in the example showed, and the walls are reused as much as possible. Sorry, I lost my... reuse as much as possible. So are we to think of a generalized phase of structural transformations made to the buildings in the Severan period, where buildings are renovated almost everywhere according to a concordant or usual modality of same teams of builders? That seems most improbable, as these structural changes are localized, disparate and very irregular interventions, which do not seem to respond to any architectural programming logic. So the most likely causes of these repairs are therefore external. As we said, as was said yesterday, given the geological situation of Ostia, one of the possible external causes could have been the subsidence of the land, and subsidence phenomena are well documented in Ostia and throughout the Tiber Delta. But in the case of the structures examined here, we feel compelled to exclude this possibility, insofar as the foundations were never affected, as we said during these interventions, and on the contrary, the new walls use the older ones as a support, a sign that they were considered sufficiently stable and resistant. A frequently mentioned hypothesis also is that the reinforcements are due to the adding of floors that were not initially planned, or the reconstruction of higher levels. And although it is a suggestive idea that can maybe be considered in many cases, it can be used as a generalized option. In the examples we cited at least, the adding of an upper floor as the cause of the repairs is to be excluded, we think, as we are not faced, again, with preventive reinforcement works, which should have been carried out before the construction of additional floor, but rather with localized, disparate, and very irregular interventions, which do not seem to respond to any architectural programming logic. Sorry for the repetition, but just to be clear. So the only remaining possibility is that of an unforeseen natural event that may have affected all these structures. At this stage, the hypothesis of one or more earthquakes can't totally be excluded. In fact, archaeoseismological studies have shown that it is possible to find unmistakable traces of seismic events on the walls. And thanks to the observations, among other things, of the so-called earthquake archaeological effects, EAA, some elements do not leave any doubt about the cause of very specific damage. Particular shapes of fractures, generally continuous over the entire height of the vault. An example here from the Caseggiato dell'Ercole. Fractures coupled with another crack to form an X cutting through the masonry. Another example here. And even breaking the bricks. Rotated and displaced wall. And so this is from Laura Piccioli's papers. And all traces that are clearly visible on the walls of the example we showed. So for Caseggiato delle Taberne Finestrate, Caseggiato del Vicolo del Dioniso, Terme delle Sei Colonne, Caseggiato dell'Ercole, Caseggiato dei Lottatori, Caseggiato del Sole, Building 562, and I think also others, which can be linked to the Severan repairs insofar as they are not found on the walls contemporary with and subsequent to this. So the cracks are only on the older walls. The problem of identifying these traces is, from an archaeological perspective, the torsions, again another example here of the walls, again from the Caseggiato dell'Ercole. So the problem of identifying these traces is, from an archaeological perspective, that the traces alone are very difficult, if not impossible, to date. For this reason, it is essential to look only at the traces that can be directly linked to repairs or construction works. And thanks to building archaeology, it is sometimes possible to correlate the damage and the response to the damage, and to put it in a very specific chronological range, as we showed, and as we tried to demonstrate in the cited examples. So if we think to attribute the repair activities evidenced in the overmentioned buildings to one or more seismic phenomena, their intensity must have been low, as they did not cause the collapse of the whole buildings, but caused limited and very specific damage that needed repair works in some specific areas. And since the technique, the modality, and the chronology of their repairs is the same, can we postulate that they are the results of a same event between the end of the 2nd century AD and the beginning of the 3rd century? If we exclude the possibility of an earthquake, how else can we interpret the traces? And we are really wanting to have, and so we rely on observation of the colleagues here present for further interpretations. And we would like to end this contribution with a simple but suggestive hypothesis. Consulting the textual sources, we find two moments when earthquakes may have affected the port of Rome. First is in the year 2017, when, according to Cassius Dio, a seismos ischiros, so a strong earthquake, a violent earthquake, struck Rome and its surroundings at the end of the reign of the Emperor Macrinus. The second, maybe more interesting one, was in the autumn of the year 223. According to Historia Augusta, and confronted with a Christian chronicle from the 7th century, a series of severe earthquakes affected many cities around Rome on the 9th, the 17th of September, and the 19th October 2023. On this occasion, Emperor Alexander Severus had financed directly the repairs of many buildings that were damaged to either of these, I lost again my, so on this occasion, Emperor Alexander Severus has financed the repairing of the many buildings affected by the earthquakes. So unfortunately, there is no evidence at present to link the damage and repairs to either of these two historical moments. However, the date of 223 seems more convincing, or at least interesting, since the sources explicitly mentions that the earthquake affected the cities around Rome, which may have included Ostia, and that significant damage was caused, requiring imperial interventions. So with this contribution, we do not wish to say that all structural intervention of the Silurian period are to attribute it to an earthquake. But the numerous comparisons between the different attestations and very specific cases found, from a technical, chronological, and practical point of view, make the hypothesis of seismic effects at least worthy of being proposed. Only an in-depth and detailed study of each building, thanks to building archaeology, will make it possible to provide additional elements of response, to refine the chronologies, and to verify on a case-by-case basis whether other interpretations are possible. Caution is certainly called for, but we wanted to show how micro-contextual studies and building archaeology allow us to further clarify and sometimes advance, at least we hope, our attempt to reconstruct the life and vicissitudes of Ostian urban micro-context. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Very, very interesting. I remember when in 2017 we were on site, yeah, in front of your caseggiato delle taverne finestrate, and I remember for the video documentation, Gedenken Stiftung, and I remember, oh yeah, this is fractures, this is seismic effects. Yeah, really? Okay, good. And we started together to analyze. You had one build about this point, yeah? Because it's, for me, sorry, this perspective not so good. And I want to give, in your presentation, there are 2-3 important points to give more to focus, yeah? First of all, about the adaptations, no? It's very interesting to your remarks about the foundation, double foundations, no, and about the reinforcement. Of course, I started to analyze in an urban scale Ostia, because it's very complex, of course. But it's very important to identify, for example, the different foundations, because we have the river, we have a different situation of the soil, no? With the alluvial nature, but we have 4 or 3 main type of the foundations. And I suggest to you about the vulnerability to consider not just the typology of building, but also the quality of the construction material and the typology, the construction building systems, everything, because it's very complex. It's not, of course, on this per who wants to analyze only just case. It's important to identify one classification, typology, construction materials, historical frameworks, and so on, and to create a relation around what's happened, and, for example, with the reinforcement and with the battery arcs, yeah, you know, in different points in the city, we have this interesting reinforcement and between 2 buildings. It's very, very important for the seismic solution, anti-seismic solutions. I believe we can discuss on your topic later. Very interesting, because today to start with the urban resilience is a very actual topic, yeah? Also in the modern time, the modern situation. So thank you very much. Um, I would like to know the first, not the second, the third speaker. Okay. We have the pleasure to have now two speakers from Australia. The first is Professor Patrick Noon. He is a professor of geography at the University of the Sunshine Coast, Queensland, Australia. A geologist and climate scientist by background, one of Patrick's current research interests focuses on ancient understandings of coastal environment change and how these have been culturally filtered and encoded in narrative and myth. This research was laid out in his books, Vanished Islands and Hidden Continents of the Pacific, University of Hawaii, 2009, and The Age of Memory, Bloomsbury, 2018. His new book, How Last Hear from Bloomsbury, is Words in Shadow, Submerged Lands in Science, Memory and Myth. Good morning, and for you is good afternoon, or welcome, Patrick.
Welcome. Thank you, Laura. Thank you
Nice
so
to
much.
meet you again after Le Mans.
Nice to meet you too.
Last year.
It's
So the floor is yours. I believe it's important now
Mine?
to begin immediately. Yeah? Yeah. You should
yes, it's
share
coming.
your
It's coming.
Yeah. Under the third symbol is a monitor. Yeah, close to
Yeah, I'm doing that.
good. Yeah, good.
You can see the whole screen?
1 second, I believe is coming. Yeah, good. Good, Patrick. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura. And it's an honor to be talking to you today in sunny Napoli from the middle of winter in Australia. I want to talk about sustaining memories of natural disasters in pre-literate societies. And by pre-literate, I mean oral societies, which is the way everyone was in the world more than a few hundred years ago, except for a few places. And I want to start by giving you some examples. This is a painting of the 1847 eruption of Mount St. Helens in the United States. And it's a representation of how it looked to local people. And those people believed that a giant eagle had attacked the mountain. And if you look carefully at the clouds and the fire, you can see that it looks like the mouth and the nose of a giant eagle. And something similar, of course, was told about Prometheus and how he was tied to a mountain in the Caucasus and an eagle attacked him every day. And to me, these kinds of stories are memories of volcanic eruptions preserved in oral contexts, in oral societies. Another good example closer to Napoli is from the Apennine Mountains in the Sirente in central Italy. And this is a meteorite crater. And the stories go that in about the year 412 CE, This area was famous for its bacchanalia, its paganism, until one evening a big meteorite crashed to the earth with a big thump, and everyone there then converted to Christianity and never looked back. And this again was a story written down about 140 years ago. So most of the time it was preserved as an oral tradition or an oral story. And there are similar stories in other parts of the world, including this one from Argentina. And a lot of my own research has been in the Pacific Islands. And this is a volcano called Nambucalevu volcano on the island of Kandavu in the south of the Fiji Islands. And around 2,500 years ago, Nambucalevu erupted, and people to this day on the surrounding islands tell stories about what was involved. And this is us collecting some of those stories in 2019. And this is a study that's about to appear in the journal Oral Tradition, and it's led by one of my PhD students, Loredana Lancini, who is originally from Milano. And the stories are so complete that we are able to use those stories to actually reconstruct the form of the ash cloud that came out of Nambucalevu volcano 2,500 years ago. Another example comes also from the western United States. This is Crater Lake in Oregon in the US, and it formed 7,600 years ago as a result of the collapse of what we call Mount Mazama. And Mount Mazama was a huge volcano, as you can see there. And there are stories belonging to the Klamath Indians that recall this event 7,600 years ago in great detail. The next story I'll quickly talk about comes from Australia, where I'm living at the moment. And this is Mornington Island in the Wellesley group. You can see in this map, in the southwest of the map is the main part of Australia, and these are all islands off the coast of Australia. And the local people have stories that recall a time more than 7,000 years ago when those islands were joined to the Australian mainland. They talk about how in the beginning our home islands were not islands at all, but part of the mainland. And our people say that the channels were cut by Gangur, who dragged a big raft back and forth across the peninsula. So this again is an example of another very old story. And how long can these stories last in oral cultures? Well, from the US, we've got stories that last 150 years, more than that in some cases, 1600 years ago from Italy, 2,500 years ago from Fiji. The Crater Lake story is at least 7,600 years ago. And the stories about coastal drowning from many parts of Australia are all around 7, 8, 9, 10,000 years old. And this was all laid out in my 2018 book, The Edge of Memory. So what I want to do today is 4 things. First of all, I want to talk about creating memories. Then I want to talk about sustaining memories. Then I want to talk about misinterpreting memories. And finally, I want to say something practical, which is about restoring memories. First of all, then, creating memories. Why do we create memories, or why were memories of natural disasters created in pre-literate societies? They were told because risk management was as important in pre-literate societies as it is for us today. It's about survival, just like today. So we have signs on the way up to Vesuvius. We have international symbols that people recognize about danger. So just as we manage risk today, so people in pre-literate societies also managed risk by telling stories, by giving information from one generation to the next. And information was interpreted, obviously, according to the world views of the people who witnessed these disasters. So if you believed that the world was held between the horns of a giant bull, and that every time there was an earthquake, it was because the bull was shaking its head, then of course, that's how you told the story. What was important was that earthquakes occur. And that, of course, is memorialized in statues like this in Turkmenistan. Stories about volcanic eruptions and the sounds and the smells and the colors of eruptions within the earth were all explained typically by a blacksmith in his forge beneath the earth's surface. And a lot of my own research in the Pacific has to do with the demigod Maui, who went around from place to place, pulling up islands or causing islands to collapse. And a lot of his activities can be interpreted as interpretations of the dynamic nature of the Pacific, of Pacific geology. So these ancient stories were also messages for subsequent generations, including us, to help survival. So that when the gods were angered, everyone knew what to do. So even today on Kilauea in Hawaii, the only active volcano on the island of Hawaii today, people still go and present offerings to appease the god of the volcano. Similarly, the Hindu people who live around Mount Bromo in Indonesia give offerings to appease the god of the volcano so that an eruption does not affect the places where they live. And of course, there's a tradition in around Vesuvius, the procession of St. Januarius, which used to take place every time Vesuvius was in eruption or threatening to erupt. So these are traditions that occur in many different cultures throughout the world. And I would argue that they are ways of sustaining memories and understanding of natural disasters in pre-literate societies. So then how do we sustain those memories? How do we keep them alive in those societies? Well, in oral cultures, information like this was passed on systematically. It was very important because it was all about survival. And there's been a lot of research done on Australian Aboriginal storytelling, where information completeness and precision was tested regularly across patrilines. So the children of this group here would quiz the children of this group here and make sure that their understanding was perfectly aligned. And memories of calamity were retained in the same way in case that calamity happened again. Then people would know what to do. And we find that, of course, not only in Australia, in Turkey, we find that in Ireland up until quite recently. These are all ways that memories of natural disasters were sustained in pre-literate societies. But of course, over the years, the unimportant details were exaggerated to aid the memorability of the stories. So giants were created. But regarding all those sorts of myths and legends as a fiction is misleading. Mermaids were created, but the first mermaid was almost 4,000 years ago in Hesiod's Theogony. And we still have stories about mermaids that are told today. And my argument would be that stories of giants and mermaids actually have their basis, their foundations in stories that were told in oral societies and were intended to inform people about environmental risk. The third part of my talk today is about misinterpreting memories, and there's a lot of that. So within the last few hundred years, mass literacy has led to the loss of thousands of years of oral knowledge. Some of it remains, but it's commonly misinterpreted. We think today of stories like myths and legends as products of people's imagination, as entertainments, and we write books like this, and we make statues like this in Bologna. And of course, Calvino was one of the most famous of the storytellers in recent years in Italy. So we judge our pre-literate ancestors as having survived by luck, as having little or no ability to combat calamity. And I think that's quite wrong, because not only have we repurposed their storytelling, but also art and poetry and dance and song, all of which I suggest began as ways of communicating knowledge in oral societies. They weren't entertainments in the way that we see them today. They had very practical uses. And our diminishment of that is something that I have attributed to what I call the arrogance of literacy. And here's a good example from Luigi Picardi, one of Italy's great geomythologists. And it refers to the tell, or the big mound here at Colossae in Turkey. And almost 2,000 years ago, this was a site for pilgrims because of its angel cult. The angels used to appear here. People used to come and ask favors of the angels. But in 60 AD or 60 CE, the site was, they tried to destroy the site by flooding it. But Archippus, its guardian, summoned the Archangel Michael to divert the flood, which the Archangel Michael did. And that is consistent with an earthquake there that occurred at the same time that actually diverted the course of the Lycus River. So here we have a memory of an angel that is used to explain the impacts of an earthquake almost 2,000 years ago. Another example comes from the South Pacific, from the islands of Vavau in Tonga. And these islands are reputed to have formed when our friend Maui came and stamped on the ground with his foot, causing the ground to raise up like this. And not satisfied first time around with how little land he had created, he stamped on it again and again and again until the land grew up and reached its present form. And earthquakes are today very common in these islands. And some of these earthquakes we know cause co-seismic uplift, just as the stories describe. So here again is another example of stories not actually being fictions or inventions, but being memories of when the land really was uplifted in large magnitude earthquakes. And the last part of what I want to talk about today is restoring memories. What use are these kinds of memories to us today? In other words, can stories about our ancestors' encounters with natural disaster help us today? Well, yes, by using human experience over very, very long time periods to predict the recurrence of natural disasters and to inform responses. I want to give you two examples from the Pacific and then one about climate change. This is in the island group of Vanuatu in the South Pacific, where in 1999 there was a tsunami that washed ashore in Bay Martelli on the island of Pentecost, the southern end of the island of Pentecost. Most people survived because they had stories that told them what a tsunami, what the precursors to a tsunami were like, and they knew how to respond. But they didn't know this through science. They knew this through their traditional stories, which is what saved them. And in Vanuatu, we talk about custom stories or customary stories. And they knew once this thing happened, they knew that the devil was working, and they knew they had to get out of the way, which they did. And they moved from Bay Martelli up into the hills. And again, we've done some research on exactly where they moved and why they moved, to demonstrate this. A second example from the Pacific comes from Savo Island in Solomon Islands. And this is work by Mike Patterson and others in 2003. And what happens on Savo, which is an active volcano, is that every few hundred years, the volcano erupts. And when it erupts, it causes new land to form around the edge of the island. And over time, that land is gradually eroded. And then about 200 or 300 years later, it's there again, and the volcano is exposed. And that's when the people know the volcano is about to erupt. The shrinkage of the island tells people when the volcano is next going to erupt. The last example I want to give you here is about climate change. We know that we need to adapt to climate change, but if we look into the past, particularly at our ancestors' encounters with rising sea level in the post-glacial period, we can find many examples of this, that short-term adaptation doesn't work, and that locally designed and locally led adaptation is much better than top-down adaptation. Again, scientists are discovering this now, but we could infer that from our ancestors' encounters with rising sea levels and climate change thousands of years ago, just as we can learn that mitigation is, of course, essential, and that survival is possible. We are the proof of that. So this is my last slide. As Laura said, I've written 2 books in the last few years about this. Both of these are non-specialist books, so they are not written for a scientific audience. They're written for anyone who is interested. So just bear that in mind. But recently I've had a paper with Margaret Cook in World Archaeology, which looks at some of these ancient stories of post-glacial sea level rise. If you're interested, then email me and I'm happy to send you a copy. I've also worked recently with Loredana Lancini and also Rita Compantangelo Sussignon, and from Napoli, but now working in France, looking at risk management in oral societies. And we also had a paper together in geoarchaeology at the end of last year, talking about Northwest European traditions of post-glacial sea level rise. So my thanks to you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Patrick, you was talking about climate change, and this climate change, we know it's a relative to, relative. In ancient times, we have a good example. You showed us these important case studies. But what do you think about today? Have we learned from the past about the adaptation, about this approach, no? For example, it's very important to preserve our memory or oral culture. What do you think? Because I believe, for example, in Italy, we haven't this culture of risk, for example. And first of all, we have a knowledge and to know the history of disasters. Perhaps is the first point, no, to have an idea what we can do. Please.
It's a very good question, and there's no easy answer. I think every culture in the world is ignorant in many respects about their past. And a good example to me is how many people talk to me about climate change and they say, oh, climate change is terrible. Humanity has never faced climate change like this before. It's something that we have created. It's something we don't know what to do about because there's nothing to teach us. And I say, no, no. The modern humans have experienced climate change on many occasions in the past, and we can learn from our ancestors' encounters with climate change. And one of the most important things we can learn is that we will survive. Um, the sky will not fall in tomorrow. The climate change is not the end of the world unless we want it to be. Um, so we can, I think, learn very important things from our ancestors' experiences of climate change and of volcanic eruptions and tsunamis and earthquakes. We can learn from those. But I think sometimes because we can read and write today, we tend to ignore anything that came before. So my research at the moment is focused very much on trying to piece together our ancestors' experiences um, of catastrophe, of calamity. And Australia is a very good place to learn about this because in many Australian indigenous cultures, there are memories that go back 10,000 years or more. And there are stories that talk about how people felt and what people did, or all these kinds of things, Laura, that make it very, very interesting as a subject for research.
To write some months ago a project in Indonesia about the construction building techniques, because the first construction material is wood, and there are fantastic tradition, no, about this, and about the memories, oral culture. And it's very important, for example, in this case, to work with the community and so on. And Indonesia, some of the Indonesia, okay, this depends where, but we have a high risks, volcano, earthquake, tsunami, and so on. And this is very important to learn, perhaps, also from other cultures, not only stay in our garden, I can say.
I agree. I agree with you, Laura.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes in European societies, we measure the rest of the world
Yeah.
by the standards of Europe.
Today is a
But in
necessary.
Indonesia, no, that's right. In Indonesia and in the Pacific Islands where I work, there is no written history that is more than 50 years old.
Yeah.
So if you want to learn about the distant past, you must talk to people and you must get their traditional stories and try to understand them. That's the way that we piece together the past.
Yeah.
So look, thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you today.
If we received questions, we forward you, and we forward them you, and when you these
Of
questions.
course.
Perhaps per mail, I believe it's better. I'm not using the channel YouTube. It's more okay. Thank you very much for today,
Thank
for
you.
your
Thank you, Laura.
contribution. Again,
Thank you.
thank
Thank you.
you. Let's keep in touch. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good afternoon.
Buonasera.
Afternoon, Professor Holmes. How are you?
Good, thanks. Buonasera from Sydney, Australia.
You must follow the streaming. That means you must.
Oh, I see. Right. Is that
Pat,
better?
Patrick, you can please you can out from streaming. Wait, Dave. There's Patrick,
Yes,
can you close please from the live streaming?
I think I have.
No, you try again, please.
I apologize. That's okay?
No yet. You are here. Yeah, there's, I don't know, you have a red color on your right, the button, and you can select it. Okay? No. Patrick? Okay, good. So, it's a pleasure to introduce this professional figure, this professor. Yeah, thank you, Patrick. David Arthur Holmes is a professor specialized in sports, is a historian from Sydney. Okay. Holmes, I can say I have met Holmes 1 year ago, and we started to talk about Ostia. And during this meeting, we thought, because the first topic of Professor Holmes is, of course, a historian, a sport historian, and Olympics and so on, and we thought about the context in Ostia and Portus. And until today, we haven't a good chronology or overview what's happened and so on. So today we have a pleasure to follow this contribution, this very innovative, I believe, and deserves to be analyzed and discussed. So now I can give you a good introduction after this, after Patrick is gone. Okay. David Holmes, Professor Holmes, is a sport historian from Sydney, Australia, and has taught extensively in this area at the University of New South Wales, the University of Sydney, Charles Sturt University, and has been an adjunct professor at Boston University, Sydney campus for the past decade. His main interests concern the history of the Olympics, ancient and modern, and the history of track and field athletics. More recently, David has been interested in the sporting traditions of ancient Rome, particularly chariot racing. The floor is yours.
Grazie, Laura. And thank you for your contribution yesterday too. It was very clear, and I liked in particular what you had to say about the importance of historical context. So well done. And Patrick Nunn, he emphasised the importance of historical context too. And it reminds me of a quote from Cicero. If you don't understand the past, you'll always remain a child. Thanks again, Laura, and well done your contribution yesterday. It's great. I'm actually hearing my voice in the background. It's doubling up. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. Oh, the third symbol. I see. Okay. Well, buonasera from Sydney, Australia. My name is David, and I'm very pleased to be part of this conference. This is a menu of my presentation today. My main focus is on gladiatorial events and chariot races in the Roman Empire. And what role, if any, did they play in the context of disasters? In general terms, the topic of disaster is very important to understanding the ancient Romans. As Jerry Toner has emphasized, and I'm just turning down the volume here. Okay, sorry about this. Yes, as Jerry Toner emphasized, disasters loomed large in the life of the average Roman. And Rome and its empire had its fair share of disasters. So here we have a few ominous highlights. And the Justinian plague was especially devastating. As you can see, the Romans thought of disasters as belonging to four types: clades, the devastation of war; calamitas, diseases and crop failure; casus, military and political disasters; and pestis, plagues and much else. It's much like our own understanding today. However, they placed a heavier emphasis on human disasters. Turning to sport. The first question that confronts us is, can these activities be considered sport? That is, gladiatorial events and chariot races. There is some contention among scholars that these practices did not constitute sport. Well, let's look at it. The term sport is from a Middle English word disport, which means an amusement or a diversion. These Roman pastimes are amusements and they are diversions. So in this sense, yes, they constitute sport. Also, they share features with modern sport. As you can see here, there's a degree of physicality. Two or more people are involved. There's a specific goal. There's rules. There's formal associations. And there's officials. So what was the role of sport in ancient Rome? Well, it served a number of purposes. To reinforce a sense of Romanness, to win the people over, and quite importantly too, to keep the gods happy. Gladiator shows, just in terms of background, the earliest gladiatorial shows were held since the 3rd century BCE, and the earliest permanent amphitheatres were constructed south of Rome, in and around modern Naples. The most important amphitheatre, of course, was the Colosseum. Quite a familiar sight. And it was also the largest amphitheatre built too, hence its name. It is thought capable of holding 50,000 spectators, which is impressive to say the least. Here we have a model of the Colosseum in its urban context. Impressive indeed. The religious context is important to take into consideration. The preeminent god for Roman amphitheatres was Nemesis, and the relationship between gods and humans was one of mutual exchange. So an important symbiotic relationship. The Colosseum had religious overtones, and it also had political overtones too. It was, after all, a microcosm of Rome itself. One would assume, given the political and religious importance of amphitheatres, that they would play an important role, even as a site during disasters. We'll revisit this thought later. Okay, chariot racing, some background. Chariot racing was the oldest and most popular of all the Roman spectacles, but the origins remain subject to debate. It appears that the Greeks were less of an influence, according to the latest research. The most famous venue for chariot racing was undoubtedly the Circus Maximus in Rome, seating for 150,000 plus spectators. It's much bigger than any sports stadium today. The biggest stadium today is in North Korea, would you believe? And it's a football stadium that accommodates approximately 145,000 people. So the Circus Maximus is quite clearly the biggest stadium ever. Here we have an artist's impression. They used to race anti-clockwise in this fashion, as you can see if you follow the cursor. And there were 4 main teams or factions. They had the Reds, the Blues, the Whites, and the Greens. In Australia, we have a horse racing event called the Melbourne Cup. They call it, funnily enough, the race that stops the nation. But even so, it pales in comparison to the spectacle of the Circus Maximus. And what's left of the Circus Maximus today are situated between the Palatine Hill and the Aventine Hill. So the original track is now buried 6 meters below, and one can fit at least 6 football fields in that space. The Circus Maximus was indeed the grandest stage. In its fully developed form, the Circus Maximus became a showpiece for Rome's traditions. It also served as a prototype for circuses elsewhere. The circus was also important for religious reasons. Before the races, there was a sacred procession, quite an involved affair, which finished up in the Circus Maximus itself. The procession included images of the gods that were conveyed to the imperial skybox so they could preside over the races. As Pliny put it, the Circus Maximus was the people's temple, their dwelling, their assembly, the height of all their hopes. The circus was also a political tool to control the population. As a site, it was a general meeting place for the emperor and his subjects. One would assume it could be used as a vehicle for social cohesion in times of adversity. We will also turn to this thought shortly. To convey the spectacle of the chariot races, I'll show a brief 1-minute clip from the movie Ben-Hur. Incidentally, this movie won 11 Academy Awards, and the arena depicted in the film was modelled on a circus in Jerusalem. So let's have a look at this. Hopefully it works. I'm not sure if the sound's working, but we don't need too much sound. You get the idea, and there's no dialogue as such. Okie dokes. The role of sport in the Roman Empire. There was a widespread support for spectacles among Romans, especially among the masses. In the provinces, the spectacles were embraced and watched with equal pleasure. And the ideology of the spectacle became so important that they played a central role in the formation of civic ideology throughout the empire. The Roman Empire at its height amphitheatres and gladiatorial combat throughout the Roman Empire. Gladiatorial combat was extremely popular throughout the empire, so much so that amphitheatres became the focal point of a city. Outside of Rome, the significance of the emperor was even more pronounced, where the emperor was virtually a deity. The Colosseum was not the only outstanding amphitheatre in the empire, and it's important to highlight this. There were many others, such as in Verona, Italy, the Verona Arena, El Gem Amphitheatre in Tunisia, the Arena of Nimes, France, circuses too appeared all over the Roman Empire, just like amphitheatres. So from Spain in the west to Africa in the south. Given the importance of sport to the social well-being of its citizens, what role did it take during times of adversity? Well, this depended on the extent of the disaster. But generally, they were suspended, and we have examples of this. For example, the food shortage crisis in 6 to 7 CE. During this period, Augustus suspended public games. More so, he banned gladiators within a 100-mile radius from Rome. So all luxuries were targeted, and sport was one of those luxuries. Another example is the Great Plague of 541 CE. Here, both chariot races and gladiatorial events were suspended under the reign of Justinian, and rightly so, as thousands of people a day were dying from the plague. My argument, based on the previous examples and others, is that the role of sport diminished during periods of disaster. Public games was not what the people nor the state needed during times of crisis. Another good quote there from Jerry Toner. The simple denarius was much more helpful than a spectacle could ever be. So what are the implications for Ostia and Portus? Here we have a good visualization of the two settlements, Portus up here, and the settlement of Ostia down here, as we all know. An artist's impression of Ostia in its glory days, and Portus, arguably one of the most impressive engineering feats accomplished by the Romans. The role of public games in Ostia and Portus is not well understood. No circuses have been discovered, and only recently has an amphitheatre been discovered, part of the Portus project. However, this amphitheatre is thought to be a private venue because it has elements of imperial architecture. As Professor Key has stated, He led the Portus project, the belated Professor Key. The activities that took place there were strictly private, largely because it was found inside an imperial palace complex. So that's why he arrived at that particular conclusion. However, there would have had to have been a public amphitheatre. This is because amphitheatres were a ubiquitous part of Rome, and many smaller settlements had them. At least 230 amphitheatres have been discovered across the area of the Roman Empire. This is the extent of amphitheatres across the Roman world. Well, those that we know about. But what about circuses in Ostia Portus? Well, a circus has yet to be located. However, it is extremely likely that one existed in the area. We have literary and artistic evidence, and smaller inland settlements had them. Ostia and Portus was not just about getting goods to Rome. It had a rich and vibrant recreational culture as well. And the theatre of Ostia is testament to this. The theatre was opulent and accommodated 3,000 spectators on a regular basis. The theatre of Ostia, so the seating for 3,000 people, is highly impressive. As Professor Aja Caraveri recently argued, 2020, magistrates in Ostia were expected to organise festivals and games and to fund public spectacles. Evidence of sport in Ostia. Although a public amphitheatre and a circus has not been located, or should I say yet to be located, we have plenty of evidence of sport's popularity in Ostia Portus. We have, for example, graffiti of gladiators, oil lamps displaying gladiators. Also, the numerous bathhouses had many facilities for sport and recreation: swimming pools, gyms, exercise rooms, and associated equipment. My concluding thoughts for now. Sport in Ostia Portus played an important role. However, and despite its importance, I speculate that the role of sport in Ostia Portus would have greatly diminished in times of adversity. Sport could not have been a primary concern in the context of disaster, as other Roman cities have demonstrated. Grazie, and thank you for listening.
Very much. Very, very interesting, remarkable presentation. you was talking about the strong religion component, political tool, also, and the mutual exchange, about the function, of the role of this of the sport before, during, and post a disaster. And perhaps now we can start to work on the archaeological aspect, archaeological evidence, to integrate this part of history about the Ostia and Portus with the archaeological discoveries in the future, because it's important now to have interdisciplinary approach. It's a very complex aspect, no, to analyze.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and about, for example, the structures. Probably we have, do you remember, you ever read, of course, about this semi-permanent structure, perhaps, like construction material in wood, like in other case studies in the world, in Europe,
Yes.
I believe in the world, you can say. And in the case of the Ostia, probably, but it is not hypothesis, along the coast, of course, where we have the circus and the other activities. So for the questions, I forward you the question of the participant in presence here and on YouTube. And thank you very much for your participation, and very, very interesting. And let's keep in touch, of course. Again.
And thanks again for putting on such a good conference. Thank you.
So, a coffee break, pausa caffè per 15 minuti.
la bottiglia? Semplice da dire. Non ti piace l'idea? No, no, no. Io faccio veloce, più veloce che possibile.
Allora, già mi stai caricando?
Sì, io sto aggiornando, sto mettendo pure di naso. Ok. Abbiamo, togliamo la pennetta. Lui è? Sì.
No, giving è la versione che abbiamo visto.
Prego di prendere posto perché proseguiamo con la sessione della mattina. Prego, prego Axel. Prendete posto per favore, così iniziamo e concludiamo la sessione. Aber wir müssen mit dieser Flasche. Wie viel Zeit brauchst du?
Come un orologio vecchio,
Yeah. No, we have a big bottle. This is not good. That means perhaps just 30 minutes, 2 hours. No, okay. Change of the position. For me, it's a big pleasure to introduce Axel Gehring, Professor Gehring, because I started to work on Ostia Antica together with you. Your fault. Yeah. Professor Gehring, visiting professor of classical archaeology at the Humboldt Universität zu Berlin, excavation director, director of the Ostia Forum project, supervisor of a graduate college. There are 2 types of project. Ostia First One project, sponsored by the Stiftung Humboldt Universität, Spitzenforschung 2016-2022, with the aim to work up the previous Ostia Forum project excavation in the forum's porticos and the marble deposit located around the forum. The second project, Ostia, graduate college, sponsored by Stiftung Humboldt Universität, always 2020-2023, with the aim to work up to the surveys and excavations in the area of the forum, including the recently discovered cemetery underneath the forum. The floor is yours, Axel.
Così? Ok, si sente. Grazie per l'introduzione, Laura. Anche è ovvio che senza il mio team e senza anche della possibilità, opportunità che abbiamo grazie allo parco, non possiamo fare queste cose che facciamo da qualche anni. Io parlerò in inglese, purtroppo. Sono qualche idea, ma forse mi chiedete anche in italiano dopo. Allora, sì. Traces of earthquakes at the Forum of Ostia, 12 years of survey by the Ostian Forum Project. So I just wanted to give a little idea about material, because in an earthquake colloquium or a disaster colloquium, it seems to be also quite useful to go back to the cracks, if I may say it a little bit easy. That is the center of Ostia, you all know, and we are basically dealing with this Ostia Forum project and its previous projects since 2010, therefore 12 years roughly. That is more or less the city center which we worked on. That's an orthophotographic picture and made by drones and by a few thousand pictures on the ground. And That is a little survey of the areas which I want to show you evidence from. Of course, I can't show all evidence, so we will choose certain points from these areas. So you see mainly it's the forum's porticos, which you can see. And on the other hand, also I will make a little side step to the Foro della State Eroica, which you can see on the right. Yes, that's basically, I call it a virtual walk around the forum, searching for collapse evidence and possible earthquake evidence. And I will start in the portico, which we call the southeast portico, number 1, and then we go up. And so, like in the circus, we try to do it anti-clockwise. So, and the last step will be to the Foro della State Eroica, which you can see on the right. Just a bit about methods, because this morning we already had a little insight into methods. We started not looking for earthquake evidence. We started with a quite simple idea, at that time still negotiated with Anna Galina Zevi and Angelo Pellegrino, that we wanted to document the first possible and complete antique surveys, mostly already late antique surfaces of the forum, because as far as the excavations were very fastly executed in the 1930s, the documentation was lacking, and so we tried it with this time quite a good standard with high resolution orthophotographic documentation. That's just an example of the North Portico. And then additionally we invited lots of other researchers to do like Undine Lieberwirth, partly looking for chemical and other organic material analysis. That's just an example. We did do that in some superficial areas. And then I come to the methods a little bit about archaeoseismological methods, how to measure and how to quantify a historic earthquake. And I rely on, and that's the same method, on a colleague, which we got to know a few years ago in Berlin already on another colloquium. And of course, that is on dispute. I personally like it quite much because it is a very simple method. It's a good guidebook. This Miguel Rodriguez Pascua, he wrote an easy, accessible introduction on how we at least to quantify and measure damage. So this is based on some theoretic theories which I do not, I can't even tell in detail because that is up to specialists. I just want to say we use this guideline to record and document the damages. Just a short explanation, that's from his book. You can see it's quite easy to measure the strength of cracks, and it's quite easy to measure the angle of earthquake damage. It's just a short introduction. I don't want to go into detail, that's part of his picture book. And you see it's a very practical book, by the way. It's more or less 70 pages like that, and you see certain phenomena, and you can work it up, and then you can discuss it with colleagues. That at least is the possibility how a normal archaeologist like me can do also archaeoseismological, I don't want to say interpretation, just the documentation. The interpretation, of course, that's up to the specialists. I just want to say the evidence of Ostia as we know it in the forum area is more or less, we have everything, the complete list of effects, of parameters, which is recorded in the book of Rodriguez. That means it's up to discussion what it tells us for interpretation, but at least we have the complete evidence, and therefore I want to show you now some examples. So let's go into the forum area, that is the south east portico. It looks like this, so very pleasant reconstructed the surface of these portico pillars, and where it was possible also to re-excavate the old trenches, we did that. And we found out that the parts of the barrel walls were used in the fundament of the latest 5th century pavement. Here you can see the evidence, that's a view onto the latest pavement and the pavement slab still preserved of this portico. And you can see in between the fundament and so far touched stratigraphy, and this allows us to get some dating evidence. And I just give an example. Also, we have also from this portico already more than 100 coins, so it's a quite representative statistical base. And these are mostly coins from the 350s to the 430s. That's a very common observation. One of our new PhD projects, Nicolo Davidi, I come to a later point to the area he works in, would agree that this is what we can find on the forum. And fortunately enough, these closing coins of the 430s are also found in the contact with this barrel walls collapsed. So then we have it's a quite nice side view of the slabs today. You can see quite clearly a sunken pavement. This can have several reasons. This is not typically connected only to earthquake. This can be fundament sinking. This can be different qualities of the subsoil. This can be also walls underneath of former building faces, all that. But the evidence is at least interesting. A sunken mortar bedding and the slabs. Not only the slabs sunken in. And that's, therefore we use these 3D pictures. It's quite obvious that you can see this like waves, the surface of the porticos. And today you have definitely irregularly sunken pavement, and you have quite obviously craters where some heavy elements obviously could have dropped in and caused cracks. So that's another view on that. And interesting enough, we also have the repair that was mentioned already a few hours ago. Dating of these effects can be only done when repair happened. And here we have a nice case of a repair of such a crater with a reused inscription, which we found in 2010. It's an inscription of Flavian times, but it obviously was reused upside down in a late antique pavement. We don't only document the floors, we also documented all the back walls and the standing walls up to 3 meters height around the forum. And of course, there is a huge variety of cracks of all kinds. And also interesting for our observation with the methods of Rodriguez Pasqua, we documented how much happened. That means how many centimeters of movement. If it's torsion cracks, how many degrees of orientation change can be measured. And then we also had a look on the direction of these movements. And for example, here we have cracks which definitely where parts of the walls were moved, and in this case on 2 different areas of the forum they were moved in the same direction. That is a detail of such wall studies. We can see also there are later repairs where I wrote modern. There's also a huge, of course, variety of recent reconstruction work, but underneath, at least regarding our crack, that is definitely an ancient crack. And it's not only a superficial crack, it is the whole wall was cracked through its core. That's always important to keep in mind. Just a little bit back to yesterday. Stella Franzole is not there today, unfortunately. I just wanted to add these cracks in the walls. I came to the idea in 2001 when I had a little look on the Casia Giardino, and at that time I did not know about seismology anything, and therefore I thought I asked some specialists, and they told me at that time that here we have a clear example of torsion, which is the wall part which you see on top was lifted up by some powers, and it landed, but it did not land in the same position again. It landed in a slightly turned orientation. And you can imagine this is not very easily explained by normal forces. There has to be a lifting force from the underground or the subsoil. That's not a subsidence or a sinking of fundaments, at least. This is already published in 2002, Römische Mitteilungen. Yes, let's go further up. We have a restricted time, therefore I have to hurry, sorry. That is the northeast part of the forum. Here one example, one of the 3 rooms. That is, we just removed a few centimeters of modern vegetation layers, and then we could document this pavement. Also, thanks, of course, that time of the auspices of Angelo Pellegrino. This time, this was still the the excavations between 2010 and 12. And we could map all the little raised pavement slabs and to find out the huge part of modern reconstruction in that pavement, and also where spolia were used, and also how it was connected to the mortar bedding. And what is quite obvious, without reason, we had some lifted areas and we had some lifted single slabs. You can see that quite well thanks to the shadow in this picture. I give you a bit more sets of cracks. We divide them. Yellow are easy cracks, so that means they don't go through the core of the wall, and the red ones, there are more severe cracks which go through the complete wall. And this all set together is this graphic. So we see a system of, so they say, conjugated fractures. That is also a quite typical phenomenon written in my book of wisdom. I always make a little bit of advertisement for Rodriguez Pasqua. Of course, serious archaeologists can't go further into modeling with 3D without, there are limits for us. But I think that is one of the not doubted phenomena. If you have these sets of cracks, which are even more or less than parallel, and they do include evidence on the ground floor and the walls. So this is what I drew here with red and yellow. That's a quite, I think, obvious example that something happened here as a system, as a systematic collapse. And I continue, that is where this modern information of the book I made the advertisement for is coming from. The general criteria how to detect or verify earthquake damage were observed by studies of recent earthquakes, surely. Rodriguez took examples like a recent earthquake of 2011 in Lorca in Spain. He also used some Portuguese examples. He mainly works on the site, also not the Spanish site, Bailo Claudia. And the advantage of these modern sites is, of course, that you have strength and direction in all parameters of the earthquake known. So you can say, we know the earthquake and we can look what it does to a city. That's a quite good example. And of course, we have to treat standing buildings, and what we find in Ostia, of course, are only the remains of some walls. So there's always, of course, a lack of evidence in our case. But it still is good to know the system, how earthquakes can at least affect standing buildings. So now we go anti-clockwise to our third portico. I don't want to be too long, not for the whole bottle, I want to speak. There's a good dating evidence for the latest floor repairs in this part of the forum. And in this case, also it turned out later, after discussing that for a long time, that it was a floor repair after an earthquake damage, which caused irregular sinking, some other phenomena, which I will show you in the next minutes, and therefore we can really speak here in this case of clear earthquake evidence, and we have a dating evidence of its repair. That is a 3D model. You have the 2nd century original preparation layer underneath. In the middle you can see this dense ceramic filling. We have ceramics from the 3rd century onwards until the late 5th century, and the surface level is the new preparation layer for the latest slabs relaid. That is a bit of a view into the material. Like I say, it's interesting. We can date the overcome of unclear earthquake damage by the improvised cavern fill, and the cavern fill itself is, like I say, with the closing of late Roman Amphora types 3, the so-called transition types, which are really quite clear, the second half of the 5th until the late, and there are some later, some equally late ceramics filling. Our ceramic specialist is present, so if you have later questions, I can hand that on. And now I come to the so-called earthquake evidence of the floor below this portico. Here we have an irregularly sunk 2nd century AD mortar level, which was then re-leveled for the relaying of the pavement in the 5th century. That looked during the excavation here. So we are digging the preparation layer of the former 2nd century floor. And here you see some of the phenomena which also are quite clear. That's a so-called folded pavement. And it's in one of the Rodriguez plates, as you can see underneath. And that's where we work. But of course, if you open up your eyes, you probably will find folded pavements all over Ostia. A nice parallel is the podium, which Johannes Strockels and Laura Peccioli will talk about later, about the Capitolium. We had the chance also to go underneath the podium, and Johannes Strockels recorded there a very nice opus spicatum floor, which was very wave-like in its surface underneath the podium. But I think we get more clear later on. I don't want to grab your most important data. Sorry, I won't. I promise. That's okay. Also, in a part which we are allowed to excavate in 2019, also one of the shops, we had the same clear evidence by wave-like distortion of the surface of an opus spicatum in the room TFR1. And two more of the phenomena. We have here, as you can see, lower left part of this complicated colored plate. The edges of slabs are missing in acquired evidence for earthquakes because of the systematic of its appearance. We have other things, even little remains of the spoliar pavement. We have what I called here now an old part of the pavement, slabs with massive cracks, which is quite obvious. And this part is sunken in irregularly. And then we have a newer part of a pavement using spolia, upside up, which is quite interesting. And this pavement has less cracks. So it was either installed afterwards as a repair or in a second phase on a certain period after. And also, this is interesting, so that even the preserved surface of the pavements shows kinds of repair of, obviously, collapse events. Here, the same again, and we have another quite typical earthquake damage, of course, up to discussion. This is so-called pop-up structures, because as you can imagine, if you look at the picture down right, if something like this happens, you need quite not usual forces. Either you push the pavement, which is quite hard to do it manually, so therefore these pop-up structures, like we may detect also in our pavements, could be a clear sign of earthquake orientation of these cracks. And this can be, you can't see it here, I know, but for example here, that's quite obvious. And this, I would call, is a system of cracks with a clear orientation, and I may go back to the origin of Rodriguez's picture book. He has cited a quite ideal example of earthquake study, which is this famous earthquake of Lorca in Spain, but also other cases where the ground is so consistent that all this evidence seems to be parallel. Of course, there are other cities where it's different, but we are talking about, obviously, the Ostia Forum area, which is not a complete city, and we also have this phenomenon that in the whole portico, at least, the cracks are quite systematically broken. Good. Of course, going back to the walls, we also have the phenomenon of displaced pillars and folded walls, also from the picture book of Rodriguez. Here a quite nice example also of the back wall of the Forum portico. Here you can see it more drastically. It's more than 15 centimeters shifted. It's not a modern reconstruction, I have to underline that. Could have been that, for example, in the 1920s or 30s they have put it on there. No, they did not. We controlled it thanks to old photographies. So that is the state of excavation when it first was excavated. The examples are many. I just say examples from Belo Claudia. Then I have a nice example from Petra, where you have this quite specific cracks, the phenomenon of bent or flexible walls due to a high seismic energy. And that is the wall which I showed you before, and that's really the rule. No wall remained straight. So even if it was built straight, no wall anymore today in Ostia is straight. So let's go to the area which we have a specific interest because it gives us dating clues. That is a quite well-known, old, still visible part of a facade, which the ground below this phenomenon happens, of course. I want to go now to this room. That's the southeast and the southwest corner of the forum. And that was some gardening work which we had to do before we approached the room. And here we found in 2012 initially, and then 2014 and 15 we worked on it, a huge marble pile, and discussing that with the former authority, Cinzia Morelli, she said we should have a look if this marble pile is modern or if it is of ancient origin, and she had the idea it could have been a very modern, recent part of stratigraphy, and so we had a look and we did some stratigraphical excavation in and underneath this marble pile. We did some additional geophysics to find out how far the marble pile penetrates the ground. And this is the plan of the room. You can see in the back wall the marble pile. And the whole area was already excavated in 1923, but only until the surface. So what we did here underneath is to collect evidence for dating the marble pile. That's the marble deposit, and it penetrates a channel which lays below this marble pile. And that is then, after we removed the complete marble pile, there you see the channel, quite visible. And I make you now a little insight into a section drawing. That's a section drawing, and here you see the channel and the marbled pile, which was on top. And the marble pile is interesting because it's quite obvious that it was an open-air marble deposit. Open-air means that it was more or less a consequence of a collapse of ceilings and obviously the whole insula on top. And that's a detail of this marble pile. You can see the accumulation of marble. I frammenti sono anche provenienti dal Tempio di Roma e Agosto, dal Maggior Parte. So that's quite important also for the collapse history of the above-mentioned temple. This is also one of the clear parts of architrave revestment. And additionally, I go to the walls again. I show you the cracks in the walls, and we have here, that is the view to the east wall, and you can see from the quite drastic sinking of the fundaments of the facade, we have a clear collapse of the east facade. With this angle, you would not be able to reconstruct 3 or 4 upper stories on top. That is not possible, so that is definitely something like a collapse, which is quite obvious. And we have the same cracks in the west wall of the same shop. Here is the cracks, and as you can see, also you have the same angle of the facade collapsing onto the street. And interesting enough, on the same street, we had the collapsed wall, which I showed you before, from another building. So we have a set of several houses and shops which did collapse straight on the street. And now we want to know more about the dating. When did this happen? Perché la datazione è più importante. Qui abbiamo un certo numero delle monete che sono state trovate nello strato di argilla e sotto il deposito dei marmi, so underneath the marble piles, and this will be argued in the next 5 minutes, if I still have 5 minutes, I hope. Good. That's nice. So that is the marble pile. Like I said, the major part of it really comes from the decoration of the Tempio di Roma e Augusto. And we had the chance to work that up between 2014 and 15. These are some of the marbles. As you can see, this nice oak leaf. Then we have the nice Capricorn part, which is makes part of one of the temple pediments. Then we have an original coppo and part of an antefix of the marble roof of the temple. And we have some inside niches decoration, which was later reused in different purposes. Okay, I make a shortcut to all that. More or less much material, obviously, from the temple of Roman Augustus, which you see to the right, moved, like my big blue arrow should show, to some kind of workshops and marble deposits, which are here in the picture on the left. So obviously the temple and its collapsed remains were reused and reoperated in a serious marble workshop. Just to show you shortly, that's what we do with the elements. We try to, based on the ideas of Roberta Ceremianucci, we were able also as a side project to reconstruct the facade and the inside of the temple thanks to the new fragments which we found here, but that's not the topic of today. What I wanted to show you only for today is that the temple podium, obviously based on a building mistake, because we have a very odd angle of one of the cellar walls, and also which caused that the cellar walls were, this substruction of the cellar walls were too thin. And we discussed it on a colloquium with architects in Cottbus, and they gave us the idea to make that as a simulation for a model to find out if the temple had to collapse under certain reasons. And this is more or less the summary of the idea. The cause of a probable collapse simulated in a 3D model could be that thanks to the building mistake, the wall would have collapsed outwards and the columns would have collapsed inwards, and the whole cellar would not have been stable enough to stand in situ. So it's a so-called unstable system, and also caused by the fact that this temple of Roman Augustus was constructed from brick parts, from brick, from cementitium areas, and of course also from travertine. So all these three elements and building materials with different characteristics caused obviously a little problem if you bring this model into a seismic activity model simulation. So I want to go back to the room with the coins. I promised you some dating evidence. Here we have something to talk about the circumstances of collapse. We have found the remains of a bar counter. Ovviamente c'era un bar una volta questa stanza. And we have found the spolia revetments of the bar counter and all its upper revetment plates on this a little bit south of it. So obviously there was a collapse even from inside, and interesting enough we have, that is the distribution of clay, and it's really a very specific clay in this room. I will come to that closer. And we have superficial finds of coins in this clay level and underneath. So I say here now elements like this glass, which we found also, and more than a few hundred coins were swept from the counter into the south part of this room. This is just a little idea of the coins. So we have a huge amount of nummi, specific of the 4th and 5th centuries, and we have quite an unusual high amount of cut coins. That means divided coins, half coins, further divided coins, and all kinds of worked and repaired coins. And that is all material of the PhD of Niccolo Davidi. Therefore, I don't want to bore you with details. What we can say is quite clearly the latest coins in the statistically relevant amount of 660 coins is Scala Placidia and Valentianus III and Theodosius II with some special editions, and this is more or less stuff from the 420s to the 430s. And then that dates more or less, that is a terminus for the clay. That means something happened then with the clay. And on top of the clay level, we found our marble deposit. And we also have coins in the marble deposit. And these coins inside the marbles, there's only one really significant one because it's from a closed context in the middle. So at least una delle monete è stato trovato nella pila dei marmi, perciò questo è molto importante per la datazione, è una moneta di Zeno. Allora siamo nella seconda metà del V secolo con il nostro accumulazione dei marmi. So, and therefore we can ask us, how did the clay level come into the room? We may think about an extreme type of flooding. That's also possibilities. And Laura at that time collected that evidence, and therefore I cite Laura with this little table. Obviously, there was no extraordinary type of flooding between 411 and 555. I don't know if that's a complete evidence. We can maybe discuss it later, but at least there's no straight evidence. It could have been from the Tiber. And therefore, thanks to the collaboration of Laura, we also took soil samples in the clay layer. Yes. Oh, sorry. I mean, it's a very nice photo, no? Yeah, okay, I could have asked you before. That's true, but yes, it's a few years ago. No, that's Laura when she took the soil samples, and thanks to the University of Perugia, the soil samples were so in all kinds of regards were analyzed, and you see already here that they seem to have, many of these soil samples, the same characteristics, and that's really cut down to the basics. That is the characteristics. That means 3 of the 4 samples come with a certain tendency from the sea coast. They call it litorali, sedimenti litorali. That's red. And only 1 would, with a certain tendency, come more likely from the Tiber or from the lagoons inside. So we have a quite interesting combination of the origin of the clay layer, which is mostly coming from seaside sediments. And that's also additionally how it looks like. We have lots of casual shells in the layer, and we have also one witness of earthquake. I want to say we have a clear evidence of a sunken but later stabilized portico fundament, and that was all excavated in the years 2008 until 2010. This was a part of the BKO and that means the Berlin-Kent Ostia excavations on the Foro della Statua Eroica. And this is a very interesting area. It consists of a supporting wall, which was a dry wall. It consists of a space between the supporting wall and the fundament, which was really filled with a very dense layer enriched by mortar. And it was also added a static extension to the fundament on the other side. And we as archaeologists asked again specialists, how can we explain? Come da spiegare questa una cosa stranamente, perché è una rielaborazione di un stilobate della fase vecchia, diciamo, e noi possiamo datare la fase anche grazie alle monete trovate fra 2008 e 2010, e qui anche siamo nel stesso contesto della datazione verso fine alla metà del V secolo. Allora the repair, which we can see then, obviously happened afterwards. So we have again a destruction layer and we have repair activity afterwards. Here we can ask many questions. I know that we can't do it today, but could this be an example of a trial and error system of Roman engineering towards a preventive anti-collapse building? Is there something like learning from static failure? Because the example is quite interesting. We have the fixed date collapse around the middle of the 5th century, and we have the foundation for new columns. And this foundation, the old foundation, was reused, but it was stabilized with this very dense soil A in the picture, which was held back by the dry wall B, and really compared dense A and C was normal soil. So that seems to be like a quite improvised but quite effective repair of a static problem of the stylobate of a previous portico. And the very last thing which I'd like to suggest also, until today, and it's not part of the reconstruction of the excavators like Calza, until today you can see this lead suspension between underneath still standing column. And I asked also some other specialists in other colloquia, and they told me that lead suspensions also could have been used in earthquake-related contexts. There are examples at Vienne in France, there are examples at Ayzanoy in Turkey, and maybe you can just discuss that also, obviously, maybe some in recently published areas of the Maxentius Basilica, but this maybe you ask the specialists. I just say in Ostia we have one example for such a lead suspension, and it's funny enough, it's the same stylobate which was sunk irregularly, and it was used to put on the column in a straight fashion again. So that means you need the lead on that side. It's only half of it is lead, the other side, so you can imagine it, this odd angle of more than 1 degree off is now filled with lead to repair the problem of the sunken stylobate. So, and that is really the last one. I want to say, first, archaeoseismology has a proper field methods and is established since a few decades to detect earthquake damages, and this can be also verified. A second point, all characteristics of a verified earthquake evidence, like at Lorca, Spain, or at Baelo Claudia, also Spain, is an ancient site, are visible in the Ostian evidence. Third, some earthquake traces have a dating frame by a terminus postquem and a terminus antequem of their repairs. And what I can say now, that most of our dated coins now, therefore I published it in my book, which Carlo Pavolini partly introduced yesterday. Therefore I have lots of evidence of repair and, due to my opinion, clear earthquake evidence around the middle of the 5th century. Carlo Pavolini, soltanto da spiegare, le nostre prove sono dal maggior parte adesso della metà del V secolo nella zona del Foro. Nell'inizio ho pensato anche questo crollo che ho mostrato nella Domos dei Dioscuri, forse è stato in connessione della vecchia pubblicazione di Velocchio Rinaldi, e lei diceva che hanno trovato le monete del tardo III secolo. Perciò ho pensato primo di un terremoto del tardo III, ma adesso nella zona del Foro non abbiamo nessuna prova di un terremoto del III, neanche della metà del III, solo della metà del V. E così il progresso delle scienze, io devo ammettere, certamente si comincia con sbaglie, ma adesso abbiamo almeno una certa prova di più di 700 monete, ben databile in grande parte. Adesso parliamo chiaramente di un livello di argilla ben databile fino alla metà del V, e una reparatura e un'accumulazione dei marmi di un tempio ciacrolato, il tempio di Roma Agosto, della seconda metà del V. Questa è la nostra prova, perciò dobbiamo discutere se c'è o no un terremoto, an earthquake in the middle of the 5th. The other earthquakes are maybe my former research. So thanks to our sponsors, and mainly I want to thank Bettina Schwarz and the Stiftung Humboldt-Universität, of course the Parco Archeologico, and also all series of directors which allowed us to work there with great joy, and thanks, of course, to our team and our cooperation partners. That's, I have to make advertisement for the book. Still, there you can read most of it. And I want to make a little advertisement about our webpage, www.ostiaforumproject.com. All recent discoveries should be put on the webpage already, so you can read what I told you today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Axel. Yeah. No, you can, I believe now you can start with the discussion. I was talking to Miguel 3 days ago because he proposed me an archaeological contribution about intensities, about to quantify the energy and so on. And I would like to have Miguel in this context, but the last time, not the last time in October, I called him and he answered me, sorry Laura, at the moment I'm on a volcano. What? I'm in Vulcan La Palma. Do you remember in October there was a disaster in Spain and now for this conference, asking him, and now have you another risk, another situation? Okay, no, it's the excavation. Fortunately, no. But the situation is not finished from October on this volcano. I want to start a discussion about this is amazing because probably I know one part of your work because in the 2016, we started to work with the 3D documentation and before the Gedenkenstiftung. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And it's amazing because it's very important to have a cross-checking with archaeological evidence and your excavations are every year. Okay, during COVID, of course, there's a problem for all. It's not but you have results, so you are constant about your results. It's not the results, for example, for 5 years ago, and now you have a restart excavation. This is very important for us, for our researchers. About the classification, I wanted to suggest the archaeologists, because I'm an architect, to create a tool of to identify the archaeological, seismic evidences, because I use a classification of Miguel and Pasqua, and it's very useful because for the students, for example, in archaeoseismology is the first step, the first classification list and criteria, because there's primary, secondary effects and geological origin and so on, and you can understand very well the process about for analyze and collapse. In the second time, perhaps you can work together because it's important to have a context and probably by a structural analysis we can integrate the first step with this classification with the other information. This is not just for you, but of course for in this field and the case of Ostia. But it's very useful because for example, in your presentation and Paolo, you have focused on a new approach in archaeology, because it's difficult, I believe, when this is in your field of research, to try to classify an evidence. It's the same for me, for example, because I'm not an archaeologist, but it's very important to have a documentation, to record. I have this on my excavation, I follow this classification, I have this. And it's very important for me, for example, Laura, I have this, yes, this is a good start. Because normally when you have excavation, the documentation is different, no? You haven't for seismic effects, and okay, this is not normal today. And this is a good approach, it's an innovative approach, I can say, in archaeology, no?
Thank you very much. Io voglio soltanto dire che anche noi abbiamo imparato, perché prima ho incontrato Rodriguez e che lui diceva forse provate e leggete il mio libro, il libretto non sono così tante pagine, ma è molto utile perché è semplicemente anche per noi da capire. Io ho mostrato tutto ai nostri studenti e studentesse, e loro hanno letto e noi possiamo capire e possiamo almeno documentare questi danni. Perciò io direi,
è fondamentale.
Il congresso, prima non abbiamo mai visto questi, visto certamente non capito che abbiamo visto. Perciò è molto utile, io penso, e anche apre gli occhi sì, non è così difficile da documentare con i metodi, perché si prende una scala e il resto è più semplice. Perciò, ma ovviamente anche sono le esigenze dell'archeoseismologo, anche per queste esigenze è un materiale abbastanza utile, che possiamo lavorare così.
Appunto, è un approccio innovativo il fatto di poter integrare una scheda, che normalmente è una scheda archeologica, in cui voi come archeologi la completate, la compilate in una certa sequenza, metodologia e quant'altro, poter già in uno scavo poter considerare in un contesto come il contesto mediterraneo, in quel contesto, in questo caso ci stiamo provando appunto di Ostia, di Porto, di poter già porsi delle domande prima e non alla fine se è un effetto sismico, comunque documentare sempre anche quello che non si conosce in un modo più appropriato possibile è il giusto metodo, è il giusto approccio anche per lavorare in modo interdisciplinare, perché se tu utilizzi una metodologia, uno strumento che anch'io riesco a utilizzare, che conosco, è possibile che si possa comunque arrivare a ottimizzare, a poter avere un'interpretazione, perché il primo giorno è stato molto interessante il fatto di poter prendere visione di quelli che sono i contesti non solo di Ostia ma di Ercolano e di Pompei. Nel caso di Pompei, se ti ricordi, hanno mostrato anche la lettura stratigrafica degli strati distruttivi e quant'altro, una cosa interessantissima che per loro è un metodo di rilievo, è un'informazione costante in certi contesti. Credo che sarebbe utile iniziare a integrare, proprio, ripeto, avere un tool, una strumentazione di lettura e interpretazione che in qualche modo ci unisca, almeno per una prima fase di lettura, di interpretazione di quelli che sono gli effetti sismici, e comunque l'archeosismologia rimane una disciplina interdisciplinare. Scusate il gioco, comunque un campo innovativo che si è sviluppato negli ultimi anni, non è tantissimo, e non a caso infatti per esempio i miei colleghi, come ieri c'era Fabrizio Galadini, si parla di Klaus, di Hintzen, si parla di Statis Tiros, si parla appunto di Miguel Rodriguez Pasha, si parla comunque di sismologi, geologi, si parla di architetti, si parla di archeologi, e questo è l'aspetto affascinante dell'archeosismologia. Ci incontriamo a parlare, anche se di discipline diverse, forse, e mi sembra che siamo nella direzione giusta, anche uno stesso linguaggio, uno stesso modo di poter riuscire. Tra l'altro hai fatto vedere anche il muro traslato, ti ricordi, l'avevamo visto nel 2017, quella sul forum, mi fa piacere che hai mostrato. Ci sono domande, avete commenti? Prego Marina, aspetta, però devi venire qui per rimanere in live streaming. Vieni pure. No, devi proprio venire qui. No, tu rimani, è una discussione, fa piacere. No, Marina, sali per favore. Lo so, ma il live streaming funziona così. Prego, Giaci.
Bene. Allora, grazie per la presentazione. Veramente ho 2 domande. La prima, c'è la possibilità a misurare, no, in inglese, how deep are the cracks? because you mentioned the wall core, and so normally you see the facade, the surfaces, and but how can we understand how deep are the cracks? Because statically, of course, this gives other effects.
Cosa ho fatto? Forse questo è meglio, più semplice. Da rispondere, abbiamo avuto la possibilità di vedere, perché tutti gli esempi che ho mostrato sono quasi immediatamente sotto il strato di conservazione moderna. Perciò non è un'altra cosa nella Maxensus Basilica certamente, ma qui è stato possibile vedere tutti e due lati dello stesso muro, certamente se è continua le fessure, e dall'altro canto abbiamo già visto, perché anche durante il processo del crollo, la malta è stata rotta. Perciò si vede anche che hanno provato almeno di coprire tutto dopo questo evento sismico forse, ma è stato possibile vedere, certamente. Nel caso della Domus dei Dioscuri purtroppo non è possibile vedere dentro, ma non lo so, forse ci sono anche metodi delle scienze fisiche, veramente sarà una grande idea di farlo, ma per noi è stato possibile vedere con gli occhi senza metodi avanzati, diciamo.
Altra domanda nella questa direzione, diciamo, hai fatto vedere questi piloni rotati. Cosa pensi, questo effetto è successo con le volte ancora, con lo speso delle volte? Oppure quando sono...
Devi domandare solamente Laura, perché lei ha pubblicato.
Subito dopo, guarda, vorrei rimandare, ok, l'ultimo intervento di oggi, e vorrei non anticipare appunto anche dei risultati, sì, sei tu che stai arrivando, è con Michele Betti che parleremo proprio del modello numerico che è stato sviluppato, e penso uno fra i primi in questo momento, per cercare un attimo di datare, cercare un attimo anche di capire la dinamica. Non è l'unico in Ostia, anche nei portici di Pio IX ce n'è un altro con la stesso fenomeno, anche se un pochino più una forma modesta, però sempre un effetto torsionale. Inizieremo nel pomeriggio alle 2 con il professor Fulvio Caroli, e da lì praticamente ci sarà una serie di interventi che affronteranno proprio la dinamica di collasso e dei monumenti in particolar modo, e lì probabilmente sarà data un overview eccezionale di tutto quello che al momento, almeno per i contributi che abbiamo, può essere, avere una visione degli effetti sismici, se realmente si possono collegare tra di loro. Questo sì. Quindi al momento Axel non ti può rispondere su questo, eventualmente più tardi anche con Johannes, parlando anche del Capitolio, abbiamo un'altra dinamica di collasso, sarà anche più un tema di discussione più completo, un quadro più completo per tutti. Bene. Grazie Marina. Certo Carlo, vieni qui, lo sai, devi... Sì, sì, sì. Sì, sì, infatti. Certo, vieni.
Breve. Mi devo mettere qua. Allora, ma io pensavo anche di parlare in inglese, poi ho detto meglio di no, perché la materia è molto tecnica.
Guarda, sei messo male, guarda dove ti sei messo. Da me ed Axel.
Ho fatto male, ma sono preso in mezzo. No, congratulazioni per questa diciamo, conferenza molto bella e splendida documentazione, anche molto visuale, molto bella visualmente. Io vorrei sapere, quindi un argomento molto specifico, come valuti alla luce di tutto questo i risultati dei colleghi geologi, sismologi su questa famosa faglia diciamo, a a est o a sud-est di Ostia, se è possibile che sia responsabile di alcuni di questi fenomeni, anche perché mi sembra di capire, però qui appunto è il bello della multidisciplinarietà che qui veramente c'è stata, devo dire, quindi parentesi, sono molto d'accordo con quello che dicevi, in cui tutti ci impicciamo, diciamo, gli archeologi delle cose, delle materie che non ci competono, ma in fondo ci competono lo stesso. Quindi è possibile che, come mi sembra di capire che loro dicano nei loro articoli, che questa faglia disposta in questo modo possa aver creato questi effetti, visto che mi sembra sempre di capire dalle vostre relazioni che i danni osservati sono orientati tutti in uno stesso senso. Ecco, quindi se, come mi sembra, questa faglia, questa cresta, diciamo, che borda il sito di Ostia, possa essere in parte responsabile di questi danni e non necessariamente, non dico di no, ma non necessariamente che questi danni siano creati dai grandi terremoti documentati in alcuni casi dalle fonti, che però si sarebbero svolti anche a molta distanza o almeno nell'area dei Colli Albani e di Roma, con incerti effetti ad Ostia, mentre questo discorso della faglia, che io ho appreso dai vostri articoli, non ne avevo idea, potrebbe, visto che sono orientati tutti in un certo senso, effettivamente essere responsabile perlomeno di parte. Certo, in un certo senso potrei rispondere non lo sapremo mai, però almeno se c'è questa possibilità, come dire, teorica, se c'è questa possibilità virtuale.
Sì, grazie per la domanda, perché e questo è veramente, diciamo, il punto saliente della discussione, perché io non posso rispondere se è possibile interpretare l'origine è stato questa cosa geologica che non capisco niente, ma io posso dire esattamente, abbiamo misurato la direzione dalla maggior parte delle frisure che abbiamo visto e documentato nella zona del foro, ha veramente lo stesso orientamento. Io posso dare il mio materiale al convegno prossimo, dove fate forse una simulazione, eccetera. Voi deciderete se è probabile, se o no. Perché veramente non è così semplice. Io ho capito dall'ultimo convegno riguardante l'archeosismologia che c'è una discussione molto aperta fra qualche professore dicono ma è necessario avere un grande computer, calcolare tutti i loro andamenti, non è così semplice come nel libro di Rodriguez, ma per noi almeno la cosa è abbastanza chiara, perché abbiamo dalla maggior parte l'orientamento e forse anche i paralleli, ma non si dice forse anche, non lo so, sono 90 gradi, come funziona il terremoto non lo so, ma io definitivamente devo dare il mio materiale per una futura diciamo, interpretazione dei specialisti. Sì, sì.
Dobbiamo dire che la modellazione è utile, sicuramente va a integrare, non va a sostituire assolutamente quelli che possono essere i risultati che derivano da un'indagine archeologica, cioè è solo una, come dire, abbiamo pensato, io proposi a Michele e a Barbara, guarda, proviamo un attimo su questo pilastro tanto conosciuto, tanto fotografato, più o meno naturalmente parlando anche con Paola, con Maria, ma con Alessandro, cioè con il direttore del Parco di Ostia Antica, avevamo già inquadrato più o meno quello, conosciamo insomma più o meno la storia anche del piccolo mercato, quindi non è che abbiamo scoperto, però abbiamo verificato un attimo effettivamente se la costruzione era vincolato questo pilastro, seppure era già abbandonato in una fase, ecco. E questo è interessante, penso, anche dal punto di vista archeologico. C'è da dire che la modellazione però su strutture murarie antiche naturalmente è complessa, non è semplice, non è una struttura in cemento armato, quindi ci sono tante variabili che occorre prendere in considerazione. E per quanto riguarda la direzione ne parleremo, perché vorrei non anticipare insomma, dei passaggi dei miei colleghi come Giovanni Cangi, come questo professore che sarà il primo della sessione pomeridiana, perché penso che, al di là che in questo momento appunto mi sembra sia creata già una discussione molto interessante, avrete anche un quadro più completo di informazioni e anche di spiegazioni, oltre alla sottoscritta. Non è giusto, ecco, che anticipi o che prenda la parola. C'è da dire però che da considerare che Ostia, ecco, come ogni altra, per la griglia, no? La griglia romana come si presenta, rispetto alla faglia, rispetto a quei nuovi casi che abbiamo individuato come vettori di collasso, abbiamo più di una direzione, e questo non rende molto, come dire, la interpretazione così semplice. Per quello occorre non solo soffermarsi su una scala urbana, ma occorre imparare forse a iniziare insieme a mettere insieme tutte queste informazioni che abbiamo, perché ogni scavo veramente, per esempio quello che ha fatto Axel, tutta la raccolta che ha di informazioni rilevanti, come per me come per altri colleghi, possiamo un attimo capire meglio cosa è successo, perché io senza i risultati di Axel, per esempio, da architetto potrei fare tutte le simulazioni che voglio, potrei individuare tutte le tipologie murarie, ma non arriverei molto avanti. Occorre, come hai detto tu, questo approccio veramente indisciplinare. Mi fa piacere che Carlo abbia evidenziato che ci stiamo riuscendo, ecco, insomma, in questa conferenza, insomma, mi sembra ci sia stato e c'è in questo momento ancora per oggi un grande sforzo, e questo non è poco, dato insomma, che finora il terremoto, insomma, mi ricordo ancora quando ci siamo incontrati, Carlo, qualche anno fa, che parlare di terremoto proprio era un po' un argomento, un po' tabù, occorre dirlo. E probabilmente è giusto così, perché gli argomenti hanno bisogno del loro tempo, di essere interpretati, di essere accettati, e ci vogliono tanti incontri e dei risultati che siano però veramente attendibili. Allora, se non ci sono domande, se non ci sono commenti, io direi che possiamo un attimo concludere, così ci prendiamo una pausa, giusta pausa per il pranzo, e possiamo anche, ecco, verso le 2 già incontrarci per iniziare la sessione pomeridiana. Il direttore di Ostia Antica sarà con noi nel pomeriggio, quindi sarà un pomeriggio finalmente, esatto, un bel tempo di stare insieme, e finalmente potrà dare il suo contributo, e avremo la tavola rotonda a fine pomeriggio. Credo un altro momento molto importante che vi chiedo sinceramente, al di là del caldo della situazione, di rimanere con noi. Allora grazie ancora, e a più tardi.